All right, so this last one, we're going to talk about 2000 to 2020. So the election of 2000 was between Republican George W. Bush and Democrat Al Gore. And this is the fifth time in American history where the Electoral College didn't work the way that it normally works, meaning the person who won the election won the electoral vote but lost the popular vote. There were voting issues in Florida, and actually Dade County, Florida, around Miami. They had problems with their machines. Their machines were not calculating correctly, so they had to recount. They had to do a recount in Florida. And so originally Florida went to Gore. After the recount, Florida went to Bush, and he won the 2000 election. So you see how close it was. He actually lost the popular vote, but it was 271 to 266. So it was a very, very close election. And you have to have 270 to win. So he won by one. So a lot of things culturally, again, in the 1990s. Clarence Thomas is appointed to the Supreme Court. He is the longest reigning justice. He is still sitting on the Supreme Court, so he's been there for 34 years. Internet debuts in 91, nowhere near what we have today. So we talked about the 60s, and there were riots in Watts. Well, we have that happen again almost 30 years to the day later. It's actually about 27 years later with Rodney King. Again, same situation. It was police brutality. Hurricane Andrew was the strongest hurricane to hit the Florida coast on the Atlantic side in the 20th century. Storm of the century, we had snow in March, which was very uncommon for this part of the country. O.J. Simpson trial takes place in 1995. He was accused of killing his estranged wife and her boyfriend, and he was found not guilty in court. And so it was a very big, high-profile case. And if you know anything about the Kardashians, their dad was one of his attorneys. JonBenet Ramsey. So there's a documentary on Netflix about her murder. She was found dead in her home. She was a 6-year-old beauty queen, and her case is still unsolved to this day. And Columbine, which was a high school in Colorado. Students, they opened fire on their classmates and killed several classmates before turning the guns on themselves. All right, so most everybody knows, basics of 9/11. Almost 3,000 people were killed. This is the largest terrorist attack in American history. And it was led by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Now, their original plan was to hijack our planes and then, crash them in the ocean. And they said that's not good enough. We want to hit them where they live in their capitalist, economy. And the World Trade Center was not just the Twin Towers. It was a whole complex. And they housed multiple multi-million and even billion-dollar companies. And so that's why the World Trade Center was, again, chosen. They all chose planes that were headed to the east, from the east coast to the west coast, so that it would be full of jet fuel, so it would make a bigger explosion. They actually learned how to fly, the terrorists did, in a flight school in Florida. And it's interesting that they never wanted to learn how to fly when they actually did the investigation after. They never wanted to learn how to land. That would have been a red flag to me, but I'm just saying. So American Airlines 11 hit the North Tower at 8:45, and they thought it was a freak accident, and they did not evacuate. They started evacuating the North Tower, but they did not evacuate the South Tower, which still, again, makes no sense to me. About 18 minutes later, the South Tower is hit lower down, about 20 floors lower. And you have to understand, anybody above the crash zone, they're not going to make it out. Between the fire and the smoke, they're not going to survive. And all within, again, about 30 minutes after this, both towers collapsed. The South Tower collapsed, and within less than a minute, it went from being a 100 floors building to rubble. And then the North Tower came down right after it. which is again why the casualty count is so high, because so many people died as the buildings were collapsed, including paramedics and firefighters and NYPD. American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, and United Airlines 93. The people on board were called, basically called, said, "Hey, our flight's been hijacked from the plane." And they were like, yeah, they've already flown them into the World Trade Center, so they knew they were planning to crash the plane. Now, people think that this plane was headed either for the Capitol building or the White House, but again, we have no idea, because the passengers overtook the pilots and they crashed the plane into a field in Pennsylvania. Now, you can go to Ground Zero, which is where the World Trade Center Museum is in Washington, D.C. It's very humbling, and it's very moving if you go in there, because they have things like, they have recordings from people who were in the towers and people who were on the planes calling their loved ones and saying, "I'm not going to make it out." So they play this on kind of a loop. They also have the black box recording from Flight 93, where the terrorists, the last thing they say before they say, in Arabic, they say, "Praise to Allah, take it down." So that's the last thing that we see before the plane is crashed. What happens after this is we start the war on terror. And again, we're not fighting a country, we're fighting an entity. So we can't declare war on Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq or any of these countries. So it was unlike anything we've ever dealt with, because again, this was a group, an organization that were housed in all these different countries, these Middle Eastern countries, and so it was a very unique situation. They also passed the Patriot Act and the Department of Homeland Security, and so this is big changes to America. And under the Patriot Act, if you are accused of terrorist activity, you no longer have your constitutional rights of fair trial, speedy trial, all of those things. You waive your constitutional rights if you are considered accused of terrorism. So people who went into the Capitol building on January 6th, around in 2021, those people are being held under the Patriot Act. So that's they're seen as domestic terrorists. Now, January of 2002, and Bush is given bad information that these Middle Eastern countries have weapons of mass destruction, basically nuclear bombs. And so everybody, of course, is very irate over what happened in 9/11, and we're like, let's get them. And so we go, full ham on Iraq, North Korea, and Iran, kind of pursuing especially Iraq and Iran, pursuing Al-Qaeda. So the election in 2004 was between George Bush, the incumbent, and Kerry, and he was a Democrat. So again, a lot of changes. So Bush appoints 2 justices, John Roberts and Samuel Alito. We have the first female African-American Secretary of State, Miss Condoleezza Rice from Birmingham, Alabama. And a lot of, again, like some of his predecessors, their second term is a whole bunch of problems. So it comes out that they are illegally wiretapping. So there's a movie called Snowden. It's a guy named Edward Snowden who worked for the NSA, and he basically spilled the tea that the government was listening to our phone conversations, and then he fled the country. So it's an interesting movie. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina and Rita devastate the Gulf Coast. Hurricane Katrina was much more devastating because it hit mostly New Orleans, and New Orleans is below sea level, and it flooded, caused catastrophic damage up to about $100 billion, and a lot of people lost their lives. And then not even a month later, we have just under a month later, Hurricane Rita hits just west of that in other parts of Louisiana and Texas. Not near as many damages. All right, so President Obama is elected in the election of 2008 and then reelected in 2012. So this is just going to cover all of his both of his terms. And so a lot of legislation. So the American Relief and Recovery Act was actually the first time Americans got stimulus because we were in a recession. Housing market collapsed. Banks were struggling because of bad mortgages. And so they sent out stimulus checks and they thought it was going to stimulate the economy, but it didn't because people paid off their bills or they put money in savings. They didn't really spend money at like Walmart or something like that. So it didn't really help us. They did pass the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, in 2010, and the Hate Crimes Prevention Act was passed in 2009 to prosecute people who had hate crimes against homosexuals. They repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military, so now you can be out and proud. There was an explosion on a offshore oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, the Deepwater Horizon. So there's actually a movie with Mark Wahlberg called Deepwater Horizon about this. Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011. And we had an attack on our U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, Libya in 2012 on the anniversary of 9/11. There's a movie called 13 Hours about this event. And gay marriage is passed by the Supreme Court under the 9th and 14th Amendments, passed 5-4. And the court case was Obergefell versus Hodges. And so the election of 2016 was between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. This is the fifth time in American history. So it happened in 2000 and 2016, where the person wins the electoral vote but loses the popular vote. One of the first things he did was sign an executive order to fund HBCUs, which are historically black college and universities, because all other colleges are permanently funded, but HBCUs were not. So when they came to him for money, he was like, "Why are you not funded like everybody else?" And they're like, "We don't know." And so he wrote this and started the process of permanently funding black college and universities, which was done through bipartisan legislation, the Future Act. The First Step Act was passed in December of 2018, and it was designed to overturn the effects of that 1994 crime bill that disproportionately affected African Americans. And so about 4,600 people have been, and this is just as of early, like 2021, at the end of his term, have been either released from prison or their sentences have been lessened under the First Step Act. COVID-19 starts in 2020. We really don't know exactly where the first, like our patient zero is. We know the effects, as you guys can probably remember. Country basically shut down in March, and New York was hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it took us, just over a year to really kind of start getting back to some kind of new normal after that. Trump was nominated in 2020 for 3 Nobel Peace Prizes because he negotiated peace in the Middle East, but he was not awarded any peace prizes. And that is the end of the 2000s to present.